Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome back to 2pPressStart's. I'm your host, GiantKiller, and today we're bringing you part 2 of our Curse of Naxxramas Preview. Last time we walked you through all of the general information we were able to dig up on the upcoming Hearthstone expansion, Curse of Naxxramas. And today in part 2, I'm going to talk a little bit about each of the new cards that Blizzard has revealed from the Naxxramas set so far, along with my impressions and thoughts on those. Then, I'll be talking a bit about some of my thoughts and predictions for how Naxxramas is going to impact the metagame, particularly how certain cards and mechanics might see an increase or decrease in power or play because of the expansion. Alright, so now let's talk about the unlockable Naxxramas cards that have been revealed so far. We're going to start with the class-specific cards and move on to the neutral minions. So that means first up on the discussion block is Poison Seeds. Poison Seeds is the Druid class-specific card, and Poison Seeds is a really interesting mass removal spell that looks like it's going to be most useful probably against decks that run a lot of big taunters, like Handlock and Ramp Druid. But it also has potential in combination with other mechanics. Death Rattle is the obvious one because that's what Naxxramas is all about. So combine this with Death Rattlers and you get to have your cake and eat it too. You get to trigger your Death Rattles immediately, on your terms, and you get a minion in play to replace your dead one. And you most likely shrank down any of your opponent's minions down to manageable threats in the process. Also, you can combine Poison Seeds with something like Starfall for a really expensive board clear. You could also combine this with Soul of the Forest to get an army of trees the likes of which hasn't been seen since the last Entmoot, and then make them all bigger with Power of the Wild. Keep in mind your opponent's going to get to use his treants before you get to use yours, since yours are going to have summoning sickness, so be sure to attack with your minions first, then turn them into trees. Next up is Avenge, the Paladin class card, and on the heels of something like Poison Seeds, this Paladin secret seems a bit underwhelming. It definitely fits the Naxxramas theme of gaining something from death, it just doesn't strike me as all that great of a card. The biggest problem is it's incredibly situational in that it requires you to have at least 2 minions in play, one to die and another to gain the buff. Or, because this is Naxxramas, one with Death Rattle will do the trick. But imagine your disappointment if you draw into this thing late game with an empty board in front of you. And because it's a secret, it can't activate on your turn, so you can't even pull off any shenanigans like deliberately sacrificing a minion of your own to trigger this onto a more deserving minion. It's not terrible, it's not even completely unplayable, it's just not anything I would consider competitive. And then we've got the Warrior class card, Deathbite. And my first thought when I look at this card, well, maybe my second thought after, man, this looks like it ought to be a Death Knight weapon, is how much synergy Deathbite has with a lot of cards that Warrior decks are already using. Beyond the obvious potential for generating card advantage by killing 2 enemy minions, and potentially more with the Death Rattle effect, pinging your own minions for 1 point of damage has a ton of uses too. Aggro Warrior decks love enraging their own Amani Berserkers and Raging Worgen with Inner Rage and Taskmasters. Well, Deathbite can do that job too. Frothing Berserkers are going to be absolutely giddy when you play this card. Control Warriors, on the other hand, love farming armor with Armorsmiths and cards from Acolytes of Pain. Well, Deathbite is great at that too. At worst, your minions take some damage in exchange for 2 4-damage swings from the axe, and that's just fine. At best, this card is going to be capable of generating a massive shift in board position on turns 4 and 5. It's basically a combination of Swipe and a True Silver Champion, so I'm kind of having a hard time finding a downside to this card. I can see this card fitting into just about any Warrior deck, and I think it's going to be an absolute beast for Warriors in the arena. And next up is the Anub'ar Ambusher, the Rogue class card. The Ambusher is a 5/5 minion for 4 mana, which is an amazing value stat-wise, and it provides you with some incredible tempo if you manage to play it on curve. So it seems like this card could have a lot of potential in Tempo Rogue. But, a lot like the Dancing Swords, which we're going to talk about soon, you pay for that tempo advantage with a pretty hefty drawback. When the Ambusher dies, you return a random minion you control to your hand. It doesn't say random on the card, but the devs have confirmed that it is indeed random. Now, this is a drawback that means nothing to you if the Ambusher is your only minion in play. In fact, it's a drawback you can actually use to your advantage in some cases by returning a Battlecry minion like the SI-7 agent or something like the Azure Drake to your hand. You can play it again, get the advantage again. But, no matter what, it costs you tempo somehow. Either you aren't playing more minions so you can get around the Death Rattle, or you're having to replay a minion because of the Death Rattle. You gain some tempo up front and lose some on the back end, which makes this guy a little bit like a smaller version of the Venture Co Mercenary or any Shaman spell with Overload. It does shut down a turn 4 Yeti play pretty hard though, and there's always something to be said for that. Alright, moving on to the neutral minions, we're going to first pay a visit to the Undertaker. The Undertaker is a 2 toughness minion for 1 mana, meaning it's one of the few 1-drops that doesn't die to Fire Blast and Shapeshift. It works really well with the other cards that we're seeing in competitive play already, like Harvest Golem, Sylvanas, Karn, Leopardome, Blood Mage Thalnos, that sort of thing. It also works well with things that let you draw more cards so you get more Death Rattle minions in your hand to keep buffing them up. Things like the Loot Hoarder, like Paladin's Divine Favor, or just the Warlock Hero Power. I would say this guy's probably better than Secret Keeper, which is very similar. That's because I would say low-cost Death Rattle minions are generally stronger early game plays than Secrets are, which buff up the Secret Keeper. And that's because you want to spend those early turns gaining a foothold on the board, and a lot of Secrets don't necessarily affect the board right away. But a lot of Death Rattle minions do. Again, Harvest Golem is great for that, and so is the Nerubian Egg. Let's talk about that combination next. This card, followed up by a Nerubian Egg on turn 2, is amazing. As a matter of fact, I can't think of many better 1, 2, 3 curves than Undertaker, then a Nerubian Egg, then a Harvest Golem. If you're looking to solidify a board position, these cards will let you do that. Overall, I think this guy's pretty decent. He's obviously going to be a mainstay in any Death Rattle-themed decks, but I think he's decent enough to show up in some decks that don't necessarily revolve just around Death Rattle. And when I say that, I'm thinking mainly about Warlock Zoo decks. I think this guy's definitely worth a try in Zoo. Alright, next up is the Shade of Naxxramas, and the Shade is definitely an interesting minion, but it's not one that I would consider particularly strong. He's basically a mini Gruul that costs a lot less, has stealth, and builds a lot slower. Now, one thing the Shade has going for it is it puts your opponent on a clock. It's a long clock, mind you, but the Shade is really tough to remove thanks to its stealth, and if your opponent lets the Shade sit around long enough, it'll eventually be big enough to just flat out win you the game. But the biggest problem with the Shade is the when do I play this card dilemma. On the one hand, you want to play it out early enough that it can start building up counters and actually have a chance to grow into a threat. On the other hand, you can't really afford to spend any of those really important early turns just squirreling a minion away for later use. So pretty much any time you play the Shade, it's gonna feel a bit awkward. And when the Shade's stealth lets you choose when and where you want to use him, if you don't also take advantage of that building up over time mechanic, then he's pretty much just a glorified Jungle Panther, and that isn't really saying much for him. Next up is my personal favorite out of all the revealed Naxxramas cards so far, and that's the Nerubian Egg. I just can't say enough about this card. I'm going to go out on a limb and say this is going to be among the best in the set. That's just because I can't imagine they'd consider anything stronger than this to be even remotely balanced. It's an amazing 2-drop for much the same reason that Harvest Golem is such an amazing 3-drop. It's got massive total stats for its mana cost. This egg represents a total of 4 attack and 6 health worth of minion for just 2 mana. That is incredibly, amazingly good. It's also incredibly durable because it gives you 2 bodies. It replaces itself when it dies. That's something that's made Harvest Golem a competitive mainstay. It's got such a good chance to stick. That means there's a good chance that if you play a Nerubian Egg on turn 2, you're going to still have a minion in play one way or the other and ready to go on turn 3. But unlike the Harvest Golem, with the Nerubian Egg, more of the value comes on the back end. Which brings me to my next point, and that is this card is decidedly anti-area of effect removal. It really discourages 2-damage mass removal spells like Holy Nova, like Consecration, like Exploding Trap, so it can actually help protect some of your other low drops from mass removal because your opponent might be thinking twice about unleashing the 4/4 Nerubian with an AoE spell. And there are lots of ways to kill off the egg on your own terms so you can get to the spider faster, including Void Terror, Baron Geddon, and Wild Pyromancer. But why waste the egg? The card's going to work even better in combination with buff creatures like Shattered Sun Cleric and Defender of Argus, so this is a card that's got Zoo written all over it. If you buff it up and give it some attack power, not only are you able to attack with the egg and sacrifice it to get to the 4/4 sooner, but more importantly, now you're getting some value out of both of the bodies this card provides you. I think this card is going to see inclusion in a lot of different decks because it's just a massive value for the cost. Alright, next up on the Neutral Minions list is Dancing Swords, and we're going to start out by stating the obvious here. These are great stats for a 3-drop. But the drawback on these things is huge. This card is a perfect example of giving up card advantage in exchange for a tempo advantage. But in this case, I'm not really sure that the tempo advantage you gain by playing this card over something else like a Harvest Golem or a Shattered Sun Cleric is really worth handing your opponent that card draw. And make no mistake, you will be handing him that card draw. Minions are incredibly fragile in Hearthstone because you can attack them directly. So if you play a minion, it's safe to assume that it is going to die. If you play Dancing Swords, you will be handing your opponent that card at some point later in the game. The only way to avoid it really is to silence it, and Dancing Swords is absolutely not worth spending a silence on. If you're going to do something like that, play Ancient Watcher instead for better stats and less mana. Ultimately, the only class that I think can really afford to give up card advantage for tempo like this is the Warlock, because you can always refill your hand later. So this card may see some play in Warlock decks, but I'm not a big fan overall. And last but certainly not least is Baron Rivendare, and this card has some amazing potential, but it is also super situational. Yes, it's going to be a lot of fun in combination with things like Nerubian Egg, Harvest Golem, Leper Gnome, Loot Hoarder, Cairn Bloodhoof, Sylvanas, all those guys. But what if you top deck into him with an empty hand and an empty board? Rivendare's stats on his own just aren't that amazing. He's only really worth it if you can get some serious value out of his ability. Otherwise, he is just a strictly worse Oasis Snapjaw or Mogashan Warden, and neither one of those sees much competitive play at all. Now, don't get me wrong, if you have a Death Rattler or two ready to go, and by that I mean on board and ready to die, when you drop the Baron, he is going to make great things happen. But otherwise, your opponent is really likely to wipe out the Baron before you get any use out of his ability. Keep in mind it dies to things like Shadow Word Pain, Stampeding Kodo, and moreover it's poised to become possibly the best target in the game for a Cabal Shadow Priest. So overall, the potential for abuse is very high, but you've kind of got to build the deck around him to be able to take advantage of his ability. And I don't know how competitive that built-around Rivendare Death Rattle deck is going to be. Ultimately, it's always hard to build a deck around a card you're limited to one copy of. And while this card is definitely going to see some play, and definitely going to cause some ridiculous things to happen, I would consider Rivendare a lot more legendary if it had been a 2/7, given how situational its ability is. So those are the Naxxramas cards we've seen so far. And next we're going to talk briefly about some of the metagame changes these cards are likely to bring along with them. And first we'll talk a little bit about deck archetypes. Well, it's tough to predict what deck archetypes are going to be the most improved by the expansion when we've seen less than 1/3 of the cards. If I had to go out on a limb and pick a deck that's going to be most improved by what we've seen so far, I would have to go with Warlock Zoo. The addition of more cost-efficient minions with staying power is pretty great for Zoo, and because Zoo is a Warlock deck, it can afford to give up some card advantage for tempo gains early on, using cards like Dancing Swords and the Soulfire and Doomguard it already has, without worrying about falling too far behind on cards thanks to its hero power. But beyond Naxxramas' impact on certain archetypes, it's likely that certain mechanics are going to be impacted pretty heavily across the board, and that's not going to be limited to just certain decks, so let's talk about those next. And first up is the mechanic we mentioned at the tail end of episode number 1, and that's Silence. With all the Death Rattle effects coming out of Naxxramas, the value of Silence and quasi-silence mechanics, like Hex and Polymorph, is going to go up. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean we're going to start seeing a Priest Revolution with decks crammed full of Silence and Mass Dispel, but you can expect to see an upswing in the number of Ironbeak Owls, Spellbreakers, and Keepers of the Grove, even though those were already in just about every Druid deck anyway, and of course, more Hex and more Polymorph. Pretty much anything that gives you a silence effect, along with some other value, is likely to see an increase in play. The ability to deny your opponent a big chunk of the value of his Death Rattle minion by negating the Death Rattle effect, while simultaneously improving your board and/or weakening his, is going to be even more important when you've got all these new and nasty Death Rattlers like the Nerubian Egg running around. Next up is a mechanic we talked about earlier in this episode when we were discussing the Nerubian Egg, and that's Mass Removal. Sometimes it's called Sweepers, sometimes it's called Area of Effect or AoE, but we're talking about removal spells capable of wiping out multiple minions like Flame Strike, Consecration, or Holy Nova. And I think the increase in the number of cheap, effective Death Rattle minions from Naxxramas, especially Nerubian Egg, could have a real chilling effect on the use of Sweepers. While Mass Removal is still going to be a fantastic way to gain card advantage and a great way to punish overextended aggro decks, the more nasty Death Rattle effects there are staring you down from your opponent's side of the board, the less attractive that Mass Removal spell in your hand becomes. And it's really not too tough to imagine a board situation involving one or more Nerubian Eggs where casting a Sweeper could actually improve your opponent's board. Now, the implication of this is, if Mass Removal starts to see less and less play, then it means it's time for those board-flooding rushdown decks to shine. And that would mean a big shift from the current meta, where we're seeing a lot of mid to late game decks, more combo or control-oriented decks, doing very well, especially in higher-level tournament play. And last, and quite possibly least, let's talk about something that people rarely thought of as a good thing before Naxxramas: killing your own minions. If cards like Nerubian Egg are any indication, hell, even if Nerubian Egg is the only example, there are going to be times when it can actually improve your board position to kill off your own minions. So at least in Death Rattle-focused decks, cards that let you kill off your own minions so you can trigger the Death Rattles on your own terms might get called in off the bench for a little bit more playtime. I'm talking about cards like Void Terror. This is a very rarely used card at this point, and while he's still not going to be a major superstar after Naxxramas is released, if you feed your Void Terror a Nerubian Egg Omelet, suddenly you've got yourself a 4/4 and a 3/5 for a total of 5 mana, and that's not too shabby. Then you've also got cards like Twisting Nether and Deathwing, which let you trigger all of your Death Rattles at once while simultaneously clearing your opponent's board, assuming he's not also running a bunch of nasty Death Rattlers himself. So while it's almost always going to be better to get as much value as possible out of a Death Rattle minion's body and its Death Rattle effect, getting to choose when and where to use the Death Rattle by killing the minion off yourself can sometimes result in a big play. So cards capable of killing off your own minions might see some more play, especially in decks built around that Death Rattle effect. And that's it for Part 2 of 2pPressStart's Naxxramas Preview / Info Dump. Depending on how long they're going to keep us waiting for this expansion, we may do some more parts as more cards and/or tidbits of information are revealed, so stay tuned. But for now, thanks very much for watching our Naxxramas Preview, and we really hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions you'd like to see answered or anything else you'd like to see addressed in another Naxxramas Preview video, let us know in the comments down below. And as always, if you like our videos, please hit that subscribe button to become a part of the always growing, always awesome 2pPressStart family. And we'll keep bringing you more great Hearthstone content right here on 2pPressStart.